Alistair Ian Blyth was born in Sunderland, England, and attended the universities of Cambridge and Durham, where he studied English and Latin. He has lived in Romania since 1999. He has translated numerous works of fiction and non-fiction from the Romanian, including works by many of the leading novelists writing in Romania and Moldova today. He is also the author of a novel, Catalogue, published by Dalkey Archive Press in 2021. In this episode, he spoke about Romanian literary scene, his entry into translations, writers he translated, Moldovan literature, and Oneirism in Romanian literature.
It was in my first year at Cambridge where I was studying literature, and this was in 1989. I started university, which was the year the Iron Curtain fell, and so I was interested in Eastern European literature in general, and Czech writers such as Milan Kundera, Skvoretzky, Ivan Klima, Bohumil Hrabal, Polish writers, Tadeusz Konwicki. But at that time there wasn't really any Romanian prose, any Romanian novels available in English translation. And so I thought of learning Romanian since I'd studied Latin, and I thought it would be an easier language for me to learn than one of the Slavic languages. And after I finished university, I spent some time in Romania. This was in 93, 94, and I started to learn the language then. Since 1999, I've lived here permanently. When I first came to Romania in 1999, a friend of mine, Ovidiu Morar, who's an academic specializing in Romanian surrealism, I went with him and I met Gelu Naum, who was a Romanian surrealist poet who'd written in the interwar period, and he died in 2001, and I wrote a piece about him for a magazine. And after that, my first translation from Romanian was actually a collection of poems by Gelu Naum, which was published here in Romania. And after that, I started translating more widely.
You've been living in Romania for, I think, last 3 decades. You have been translating from Romanian to English. What kind of impact it has on your translation?
Living in Romania, of course, it means I'm surrounded by the language permanently, which is an advantage over living in another country and having access only indirectly through the written word, dictionaries, or through the media. So here you have I have direct access to the living language spoken all around me, which you're able to pick up on a lot more nuances and have the dynamic of the language, how it changes, just the aspect of the language through dictionaries, but the synchronic aspect of it as it's changing, as it's spoken now in the present.
Now, how vibrant is the literary scene in Romania? Tell us about literary scene and, of course, translator community, reading culture in Romania too.
There is a very vibrant literary scene after the 1989 revolution, when writers became free to express themselves in whatever way they liked. In the first decade or so after the revolution, Romanian literature was mainly focused on maybe the memoir genre, coming to terms with the trauma of the past, and so not so much fiction. But in the 2000s, the novel, contemporary fiction really took off, and that was centered mainly in the city of Iași rather than Bucharest, where one of the big 2 Romanian publishers, Polyrom, is based in Iași, and they started publishing young novelists. And so there was a very vibrant fiction scene developed there in Iași. But there's also a very vibrant poetry scene in Bucharest. There are poetry readings regularly. And Romania is a relatively small country, population of about 20 million, but for the country's size, there's a lot being written and published, even though there aren't so many readers. But there is a strong literary scene, but not so many people reading, even though maybe that's a problem worldwide. But yeah.
And about the translators into other languages, not only English.
Yes, the Romanian literature is quite widely translated in European languages, particularly neighbouring languages, Bulgarian, Hungarian, Polish, but also there's quite a lot translated in German, in French, in English. Less is translated than in these languages.
Now, are there any organizations which are supporting translations?
Yes, there's the Romanian Cultural Institute, which provides translation grants. There are also various foundations which provide grants as well.
Now, any indie presses in UK and USA which are focusing on getting the Romanian literature into English?
Yes, in the United States there was Dalkey Archive Press, which I'm sure you're familiar with, which is one of the most prolific publishers for translation in general. I think they publish more literature in translation than any other publisher in the English-speaking world. And this was an independent publisher. And in the UK, there's Istros Books, which has published translations of Romanian authors. Some of them I've translated. Ioana Purfulescu, the Istros Books, recently published her novel called Jonah and Her Daughters. Also Ludovic Bruckstein, they published 3 books by Bruckstein, who was a Jewish Romanian writer who died in 1988.
Now, please tell us about the important writers who inspired you to get them translated into English.
As I say, the first Romanian writer I translated was Gelu Naum, a surrealist poet. This was because I'd always been interested in Romanian surrealism, and another important Romanian writer I've translated is Dumitru Țepeneag, who, a novelist and a short story writer, started publishing in the 1960s in Romania. And he developed what is known as the Oneirist movement, along with the poet Imov. And basically, Țepeneag himself described it rather clearly as Oneirism descended from the ape of surrealism. So Oneirism, whereas surrealism through automatic writing, for example, directly channels the unconscious, it's a writing in a dreamlike state without any conscious control. Oneirism, his aim was to create a text which was dreamlike in its structure, but created using complete conscious, lucid control. So the aim is to create a text which is structurally dreamlike, but you do this in a conscious, deliberate manner, as opposed to automatic writing, which is free, untrammeled, unbound by any conscious or structural technique. Țepeneag, he published 3 collections of short stories in Romania in the 60s, which were in the third person. But in the early 1970s, after the communist regime effectively banned Oneirism because they saw it as subversive, the only literary genre that was really approved at the time was socialist realism. So Oneirism went against everything that the communists were trying to impose in the literary sphere. But after Cepenag was exiled in France, he began to write in the first person. The Oneiric ideas in his novels is that the characters in his novels actually have an existence independent of the author. They lead this the same as if you dream of somebody, the person you're dreaming of has an existence some independently of you, the dreamer. You can't control their actions in your dream, and so it's the same in the Oneiric novel. The characters somehow independently of this first person narrator, he can't control what they're doing in his novel. And so this is one of the Oneiric structural elements of his novels. And in this novel, the character he's writing to at the beginning here, again, she, in a way, she's a Marianne is symbolic of the French language, which had to adopt as a writer after he was exiled from Romania. And she's very critical of his endeavours as a novelist, and she's his antagonist somehow in this novel. As is obvious from the passage I've read, he writes in a very way which it's not particularly difficult to translate.
Romanian is also spoken in Moldova, and Moldova too, I gather it has a very rich literary tradition. Tell us about important works you have translated from Moldovan literature.
I first came into contact with Moldovan literature through Moldovan writer Vitalie Ciobanu, who's head of the Pen Club Moldova, and he asked me to translate a number of texts for a Pen Club anthology of Moldovan writers, and including a novel called Before Brezhnev Died by Iulian Ciocan, which was subsequently published by Dalkey Archive Press. And this novel was part of the first in a trilogy about Moldova, past, present and future. So in the Before Brezhnev Died, it's a novel of Soviet Moldova, which uses a kind of collage technique of different characters from different walks of life in Soviet Moldova, from war veterans to collective farm workers to a housewife who episode of the grim black humour is killed by a falling crane, which is the symbol of socialist progress, and the husband tries to fight for justice for his dead wife, but comes up against an inhuman bureaucratic system which holds human life in contempt. And the second novel, which hasn't been translated, it's a novel of contemporary post-Soviet Moldova with all its problems of corruption and poverty and so on. And the third novel is set in the future in which Russia invades Moldova. And so this is rather prophetic in a way, because it was published a few years before Russia invaded Ukraine. But another novel from which I translated an excerpt was Emilian Galaicu Poun's Living Tissue 10 by 10, which was also published by Dalkey Archive Press. And again, this is a novel which spans the period from Soviet rule of Moldova to the present day.
Coming to your other works, one very interesting title I found is An Intellectual History of Cannibalism.
Yes, this was an academic work which I translated in 2009. In Romanian, the title was Crud, which contains an untranslatable pun. In Romanian, crud can mean both raw and cruel. So the title in Romanian was The Raw Philosopher or The Cruel Philosopher. And so this is about an academic work about the ways in which the cannibal was used in Enlightenment philosophy to test questions of natural law and so on.
One more work of yours is Catalogue.
This novel it's set in the Bucharest of the 1990s, and there's a narrator who is also a translator and a character who, the communist period, worked as an editor, proofreader for a publishing house which published translations of the Russian classics. The publishing house was called Cartea Rusa, the Russian book. And so this character he meets worked at this publishing house, but was also a political prisoner. And the character compiles a card catalogue of his reading notes of the Russian classics he edited and proofread for this publisher. And part of the novel includes examples of the cards from his catalogue containing reading notes, for example, of every single mention of the cockroach in the Russian novel, from Gogol to Tolstoy to Dostoevsky. And so a card for each mention, but his notes also reveal something of him as a character and his history as a character, and also philosophical ideas, if you like.
What are you currently working on, Alistair?
I'm currently working on another collection of stories by Jewish Romanian writer Ludovic Bruckstein, who was born in what is now the Ukraine and became part of Romania after the First World War, Maramureș. And he was an Auschwitz survivor, and Istros Books have published 2 collections of his stories about the Holocaust, and another collection of stories about Jewish life in Maramureș in the 18th, 19th centuries. And the collection I'm working on now is in the post-war, the present day, when he wrote them in the 1970s, 80s.
Any passage or paragraph with you now?
The passage is from his last novel, which was his final novel, which was published in 2010. So this passage is the opening of his final novel, and it actually brings up a number of questions to do with translation and translatability. I'm going to write to her because I simply must tell somebody about it. I want to share with her the new way of composing a novel that I have in mind. Structure is what interests me the most in a novel, but apart from that, to be honest, I don't care about telling a story, even a very interesting, enthralling, sensational story. That kind of thing leaves me cold. Even as a reader, I'm not very interested in the subject, and that's why I rarely read literature. Novels, I prefer novellas. They're shorter. She knows this very well, and so there's no point in my telling her yet again, or, which is more likely, in her contradicting me. She loves contradicting people. No, this isn't why I'm going to write to her, especially given that it's harder for us to quarrel long distance, for us to contradict each other, to defend our different viewpoints like 2 intellectuals, each convinced of their own ideas and ready to argue for them to the bitter end. There's nothing wrong in that, especially given that I'm not at all sure that I will succeed. There's no question of my convincing her, but I can't even swear that I'll go the whole way with this vague plan I have in my head, to write another novel that won't be like any of the other ones I've written up to now. Marianne is in New York at the moment, and it takes the mail a few days to get there. That's as quick as it can be. So that means 3 or 4 days for the letter to arrive, and then another 2 days before she deigns to reply. Sometimes it doesn't take her more than a few hours. She writes quickly and she thinks quickly, not to mention that she gets angry quickly because she loses her temper over about anything. Of course, her temper tantrums are a pose. She's spoiled and she knows she can get her own way. You might even say I'm the one who's to blame for always having let her get her own way. All the same, I think that ever since she was little, ever since childhood, when her parents probably pampered her, she was an only child, and put up with all her caprices, ever since childhood, as I was saying, she's been accustomed to being flighty and demanding at the same time. How do I know this? If I didn't know, who else do you think would know? Anyway, I won't get a reply for 7 or 8 weeks from now, and that's being optimistic. And then what will I do? If I wait that long, I'll lose my urge to write, and then I'll start playing chess instead. Or worse still, I'll start translating something. I'll play the part of Flea the Footman to some great writer or other. Let's see how they translate that illusion. I'm not saying I don't like that. I love to translate, to luxuriate in 2 languages that I can speak almost equally well. But translation, whatever they might say, is a waste of time for a writer. And at my age I'll end up bitterly regretting any waste of time, in the final moments before I commit suicide or when I'm confined to a wheelchair without either the will or the strength to kill myself. You've gone crazy, Marianne would shout if she could read my mind, if she could observe everything passing through my head as I sit stupefied here in front of the computer, carrying on this monologue instead of writing, especially given that I have no excuse whatsoever. Nowadays, thanks to the computer, we are no longer able to talk to the paralyzing whiteness of a sheet of paper. We can no longer complain. And so I ought to make an effort to write anything, as long as I can say that I'm writing, that my fingertips are tapping the keyboard of the ordinateur. I don't like the word computer, not only because it comes from English. I just don't think it's an appropriate word for the tool in question, although maybe it used to be, long ago. Whatever happens, something will still crop up on the vaguely white square in front of me. So I ought to make an effort to write anything, as long as I can say that I'm writing, that my fingertips are tapping the keyboard of the ordinateur. Although I don't like the word computer, and not only because it comes from English. I just don't think it's an appropriate word for the tool in question, although maybe it used to be, long ago. Whatever happens, something will still crop up on the vaguely white square in front of me. All right, here is what I'm going to do. I'm going to create a monologue, tapping away at the keyboard of the ordinateur. Agreed, it's not an email I'm writing, because Marianne doesn't have an ordinateur where she is, nor is it even a letter. I should say that my printer is broken, and therefore I couldn't even pretend that I'm writing her a letter. There wouldn't be any point. What I mean is that despite appearances, I have no intention of fooling anybody, and certainly not her. That's the opening of the novel.
Thank you for this wonderful conversation, and thank you for your patience. We had to postpone.
Thank you for your patience with my technical problems. Thank you.